So, when you picture a medieval knight, what do you see? I bet it's something like shining armor, right? Galloping on a horse, maybe rescuing someone, a whole code of honor? Yeah, well, the version we all got from movies and fairy tales, it's about to get completely turned on its head.
I mean, this is the classic view of the Middle Ages, isn't it? A time of chivalry, honor, epic battles. It sounds amazing, and it makes for a fantastic story, for sure. But here's the thing, it's pretty much just a story.
So that really begs the question, what was a knight's life really like? I'm talking about the day-to-day grind. And let me tell you, the truth is so much darker, way stranger, and honestly, a lot more interesting than the legends. All right, let's dive right in. First up, brutal battles, not heroics. We have to start with the one thing that defined a knight, right? Battle. And you can just forget everything you've seen on screen, all that glorious, fearless fighting. The reality? Oh man, it was something else entirely. Just look at this. On one hand, you've got the legend, the fearless hero. But the reality? It was more like a terrified guy, absolutely overburdened and probably shaking behind that metal visor. And you know what one of the biggest reasons for that fear was? The very thing that was supposed to keep them safe, their armor. Get this, 50 to 70 pounds. That is insane. I mean, try to imagine running around, let alone fighting for your life, with a 10-year-old kid strapped to your body. It was just so heavy, so clunky, and if you fell down, good luck getting back up. That armor could literally become your steel coffin. And a perfect, horrifying example of this is the Battle of Agincourt back in 1415. So you've got these French knights, right? They're wearing over 60 pounds of armor. They're trying to march through this ridiculously muddy field in the rain, and they're facing a storm of English arrows. What happened? So many of them just collapsed from pure exhaustion, couldn't get up, and were either trampled to death or just drowned in the mud. Completely helpless. Okay, but you might be thinking, what about jousting? That was a noble sport, right? Not so much. It was unbelievably brutal. Broken necks, smashed bones, permanent injuries, that was all just a normal Tuesday at the jousting tournament. You should think of it less like a sport and more like a high-speed collision where getting mangled was kind of part of the fun. And nobody, I mean nobody, was safe. Even King Henry II of England suffered near-fatal injuries from jousting. If the king himself could almost get taken out, you know this was no joke. It was way more than just a glamorous show for the court. But here's the thing. Fighting wasn't just about swords and shields. A huge part of being a knight was psychological warfare. Sometimes their most powerful weapon wasn't the steel in their hand, but the fear they could put in their enemy's heart. I mean, they used everything to freak out their opponents before the fighting even started. We're talking armor designed to look terrifying, huge, intimidating flags and banners, deafening war cries and horns, and just massive, overwhelming formations of soldiers. The Teutonic Knights, they were absolute masters of this stuff. They could break an army's spirit with their reputation alone. So, life on the battlefield was brutal. But what about off the battlefield? Well, that's our next section. Poverty, sickness, and survival. Because a knight's daily life was its own kind of war, a constant struggle against things way less glamorous than an enemy soldier. So about that armor we just talked about, how did they even pay for it? The short answer is most of them couldn't. This comparison is just wild. One suit of armor cost about the same as a small farm. It was basically the medieval version of a supercar. Only the super rich lords could afford the top-of-the-line model. So what happened if you weren't rolling in cash? Well, you had to borrow armor, or even worse, wear shoddy second-hand stuff that didn't even fit right. Can you imagine charging into battle wearing a helmet you can barely see out of, or with a big gap in the armor right over your shoulder? I mean, you're basically putting a "hit me here" sign on your back. It was a potential death sentence before you even started fighting. And their education, well, it was laser-focused. Just look at these priorities. It was all about fighting skill and strategy. Reading and writing? Pfft, that was for monks. And the result is kind of shocking. You had these incredibly powerful knights, guys who commanded armies and ruled over huge territories, who were totally illiterate. They couldn't even sign their own name, they'd just make a mark. And you can forget about those big, glorious medieval feasts you see in movies. When a knight was on campaign, the menu was grim. We're talking super salty meat that was barely edible, bread so stale you could chip a tooth on it,
and weak, watery ale. And when things got really desperate, like during the Siege of Orleans, they were starving. They ate whatever they could find, and that included rats, seriously. Malnutrition and diseases like scurvy could kill you just as easily as a sword. So, you take the brutal battles, you add in the terrible food, and then you throw in all the diseases you could get from an infected cut, and what do you get? You get this. Less than 30 years old. That was the average life expectancy for a knight during a war. It was a short, violent, and incredibly dangerous job. All right, so that brings us to the big one, the whole idea that holds the knightly myth together, chivalry, this noble code of conduct. But was it really a guide for how to be a good person, or was it just a convenient myth?
Let's take a look at Edward, the Black Prince of England. History books celebrate him as a hero, like the poster boy for chivalry. But this same guy, during his campaigns in France, ordered the massacre of entire towns of unarmed people. He burned villages to the ground. That massive gap between the ideal and the reality, that wasn't a one-off thing. That was just war.
So you have the ideal, defend the weak, uphold honor, all that great stuff. But the reality? For a lot of knights who were basically mercenaries, it was all about plunder, power, and just plain survival. Protecting the little guy? Yeah, that usually came last, if it came at all.
Okay, so we've seen how battle and daily life were nothing like the stories. And we've seen how chivalry was often just for show. But the story of knighthood has one more little surprise for you. And here is, not all knights were men. Now, it was super rare, don't get me wrong, but it happened. We have records of women who fought in battle. Some even disguised themselves to lead armies. Of course, the most famous example is the one and only Joan of Arc, but she wasn't the only one. These women completely shattered the expectations of their time. So, when you put it all together, the true story of the knight, it's not a simple fairy tale about heroism. It's a much more human story, really. It's about fear, survival, and just trying to make it through in a complicated and really violent world. And it kind of makes you wonder, right? If the image we all have of the shining knight is mostly a myth, what other truths from history are really just great stories? What other well-told myths are just sitting there, waiting for us to take a closer look?